Welcome, everyone. Great to see so many folks here joining us. First, before we get started and introducing our first keynote, I'd like to just welcome everyone on behalf of the COBRA for Opioids and Overdose in Rhode Island, for the West Virginia Clinical Translational Science Institute, for the West Virginia Idea Network and Biomedical Research Excellence Center, the Rural Drug Addiction Research COBRA in Nebraska, and the Center for Addiction and Disease Risk Exacerbation in Brown University in Rhode Island. We welcome everybody to the 2022 Symposium on Substance Use and Research. My name is Rick Bevins. I am the Center Director for the Rural Drug Addiction Research Center at the University of Nebraska. And as I said, we are very excited to see everybody here today. And I can't tell you how I just love this virtual symposium with all of our co-hosts across the idea states of West Virginia and Rhode Island. It makes us a stronger, more impactful science and discussion and collaboration. So thanks to our co-host collaborators at the centers. With that, I would like to just sort of note that this is our third year hosting this virtual symposium. This week, participants will be joining us from a broad range of disciplines, expertise, and geographical locations. This national event has amazing scholars doing research that spans identification of basic and synaptic processes all the way to people working on potential interventions and prevention strategy. Truly a transdisciplinary group here interested in learning from each other. I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge how the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted and continues to impact the causes and consequences of substance use and misuse. You can learn more about these topics and as well as on many other topics at the rapid fire poster session, which is 30 minutes after our opening keynote, as well as in the short presentations that'll happen tomorrow. We also have some great programming on professional development in the afternoons. If our grant won yesterday was any indicator, there's going to be an exceptional exchange of ideas and thinking on professional development. At any point in time, if you're having technical difficulty or have questions, please, you can just reach out to us at the email rdar@unl.edu, rdar@unl.edu. With that, I am not going to eat up any more time. I am going to introduce our first keynote. It is my great honor to introduce Dr. Michael Taffe. Dr. Taffe has a bachelor's degree from Colorado College in 1990 and his PhD in experimental psychology from the University of California, San Diego in 1995. He was appointed to the faculty of Scripps Research Institute in 2000 and was recruited down the street to the Department of Psychiatry at UC San Diego in 2019. He has published extensively and has been consistently funded by NIH over the years for his research on substance use and misuse in preclinical models. His work is focused on potential harms and health risks that occur with acute and chronic exposure to psychoactive drugs such as MDMA or ecstasy, alcohol, THC, designer cathinones, or what we might know as bath salts, prescription and illicit opioids. I have had the privilege of serving with Mike on NIH study sections for many years. He is by far, I would consider, the most thoughtful panel member I have ever served with. He is among the best pharmacologists out there. And he is absolutely generous with his knowledge and his thinking, and I really appreciate it. I'm very lucky to call him not just a colleague, but a friend. Over the years, his reflections and counsel to me have been invaluable, and I'm glad I have this public forum to thank him for that publicly. So thank you, Mike, very much for everything over the years. So without pausing, today, Mike is going to give us an update on racial inequities and NIH funding. Mike, thank you.
Thanks, Rick. And thank you all for attending. I do have some disclosures. So I am a frequent applicant to the NIH for research grant funding, and therefore my professional success, and that includes personal remuneration, depends in many ways on how NIH chooses to award their grants. Right from the start, I think I should mention that I'm going to be talking about both equity for individuals and the value of diversity for institutions, whether that be universities or the NIH itself. This talk is going to have a tendency to conflate those two things. But I would just want to emphasize it's not meant to imply that the equity for individuals is only good, is only valuable in service to this value for institutional goals. I will conflate these things, but I think we can probably walk and chew gum at the same time. One of the fundamental underlying concepts of this entire talk is that the funding is the science. If it's not funded, the science doesn't get done in the biomedical disciplines of the United States. I have three sort of main goals I'm going to try to address here. I want to educate you a little bit on a grant funding disparity that leaves Black PIs at the short end of the stick, and the topics that are of disproportionate interest to them. I want to discuss the implications of topic diversity a little bit in substance abuse research, and interweave will be some comments about the implications for diversity hiring initiatives that have been very popular since about 2020 in the wake of the George Floyd killing. Okay, so as many of you are aware, the United States has about 14% Black people in it. A couple of key states are listed here, which are somewhat below the average. When I gave this talk for the radars at UNL about 6 months ago, I noticed that they have about 2.6% Black faculty, just sort of randomly. West Virginia University has about 3.6%, and Brown University has about 7.1% Black faculty. Of course, that's not broken down by discipline. We have an underrepresentation issue in the academy. Everybody knows this. And there have been a lot of efforts, great ones, to diversify universities with new hiring initiatives. And so one of the fundamental take-home concepts of this talk is going to be that our efforts to hire new Black faculty are going to fail ultimately if we don't fix the Ginther gap. Okay, so in 2011, Donna Ginther and some colleagues from the NIH published this paper showing that for NIH's R01 grants submitted between 2000 and 2006, if they happen to have a white PI, that's here, 29% of them were funded. And if they happen to have a Black PI, 17.1% of them were funded. And there was a small reduction for Asian PI applications. This worked out to be about 58% of the chance for Black PI applications, or conversely, a 1.7-fold advantage for applications that had a white PI. Despite a lot of nice talk in the wake of that finding, in 2019, there was a follow-up study which looked at, again, R01 grants, this time for a new sample, 2011 to 2015. Overall success rates had fallen, but if that application happened to have a white PI, 17.7% of them were being funded. And if it happened to have a Black PI, only 10.7% of them were being funded, which worked out to be about 60% of the chance for those applications with Black PIs, or a 1.65-fold advantage if they happen to have a white PI. Now, of course, immediately people wanted to know, well, what about my favorite institute or center? I'm going to use some jargon here, the I's and C's, institutes and centers of the NIH. What about the ones of interest to me? And in particular, what about the brain ones? Well, certainly from the 2011 with the publication of Ginther all the way through to recently, the NIH didn't give us any information. They didn't seem to know. With some pointed advocacy on the part of many people, including myself, some of the institute directors have taken upon themselves to cough up their data. And so this is data that George Koob presented in an RSA conference, an academic science conference related to alcohol. Looking at all the research projects grants from 2010 to 2020 at NIAAA, they found that, the short story is that if they happen to have a white PI, 21% of them were being funded. If they happen to have a Black PI, 12% of them were being funded, which worked out to be about 57% of the chance. The Black PI applications are a 1.75-fold advantage. So that's NIAAA. What about National Institute of Mental Health? Josh Gordon has pushed forward on this analysis. Sorry, this chart is a little bit difficult. It's sort of the flow diagram of how an application fares. But suffice it to say, for almost everything that they funded, so it's not just R01s now, from 2008 to 2019, they came up with 1,000 applications supporting at least one Black PI. We have multi-PI now. And 34,000 applications that had no Black PI on them. So that's the distinction here. And what they came up with is that, if it happened to have no Black PI, 15% of them were being funded. If it happened to have a Black PI, 9.3% of them were being funded. And that worked out to be about 62% of the chance for those applications with Black PIs are a 1.6-fold advantage if they did not have a Black PI. And I'll just point to you a little bit here to limit the detail, which is this number right here, which is, this is the pickup number. So these are, they had to operationalize it a little bit, but these are the rates of funding for applications that scored above 35 percentile. So that's pretty bad. And what you see here is there's just about a doubling of the rate, the pickup rate for applications that had no Black PI compared to those that had a Black PI. Okay, well, NIDA apparently doesn't have this problem. So these are limited data that were presented at an advisory council meeting last February. It encompasses all RPGs, research projects grants, which is the laundry list, and only for fiscal year 2020. But what they found, they did a very similar analysis as has been pioneered by Josh Gordon at NIH. They found that there was no disparity. And in fact, 20% of the application with Black PIs were being funded versus 18.7% if they happen to have a white PI. So the reason why this is important is because, you know, I and others have been saying, you know, pretty much since Ginther came out that, you know, we want this sub-analysis at the institute and center level, because if we find, one of the reasons, if we find an institute or center that seems to be doing better on this, well, maybe the rest of the NIH could learn something about what they are doing. And so, you know, it perplexes me why it's taken so long for NIDA to cough up these data. And it perplexes me why, you know, they're not shouting this from the rooftops about how great they're doing and explaining to us how they're doing it. But with that said, it's nice to see the data. So does this really matter? So let's talk a little bit about the retention of Black faculty. As I said, many institutions are having hire initiatives. UCSD certainly has a new hiring initiative every month, it seems like, coming out. Grants matter. So for example, and you can Google this stuff up readily on the internet, which I did, and look for promotion criteria here at Brown University Medical School, where it says that in order to make tenure, to become an associate professor, you have to have significant independent, external, competitive, peer-reviewed grants in order to become associate professor. This is West Virginia University, where you see in the biology department, successfully funded grant proposals, along with publications, are the most important evidence of scholarly productivity. And writing grant proposals, apparently not even getting them, may be important in consideration for performance-based raises. And then the School of Medicine at West Virginia. A high-quality research program with significant peer-reviewed extramural funding as PI, and they go on to emphasize that if you have some as co-I, it's not good enough unless you document that you've had a PI-like role on that grant. Other institutions may not be so specific about grants. So here's University of Nebraska-Lincoln promotion criteria, and it says to attain rank of associate professor, scholarly and creative work, teaching, research, etc. Doesn't specifically mention grants, but if a young assistant professor there clicks through to the research statement examples about how they're supposed to prepare their tenure file, the example in the sciences says this research is supported, grant, money dollar, dollar figure, grant dollar figure. And the social sciences, NIH grant, dollar figure, and then emphasizes how many NIH applications they've put out because vigor is appreciated for tenure there. Okay, so even if it doesn't say explicitly, you got to have a grant for tenure. So it matters for retaining faculty. What about, what about the nature of those faculty? So it's all very well and good. And this is something we're going to be battling at on every search committee. Are we merely interested in people that do the same old science in the same old ways, with the same old approaches that happen to have browner skin? Is that diversity? Or are we really genuinely, interested in people who have diversity in different interests, different approaches, different ways of thinking about science than we are used to having in our respective institutions? This came up in the analysis. So one of the things about the Hoppe paper is not just the replication of the disparity, of the grant disparity, but they looked into something about the nature of the grants themselves. And so they used this sort of informatics approach to cluster applications on their similarity. They came up with 150 topic-based clusters out of the tens of thousands of applications they received in that Hoppe sample, 2011 to 2015. And they discovered that about 37.5% of applications that had Black PIs mapped to only 8 of those topic clusters. And of those 8, 6 had award rates that were lower than the NIH average. Aha, they said. This explains the disparity that these are people who are applying in domains that aren't very fundable or are less fundable. Okay, so one thing that they sort of undersold, they did report it in the paper, but they really undersold it as a takeaway message, is that despite the fact that there was this difference based on topic, and despite this disparity of applications in those topics, African-American PI application were disadvantaged no matter what topics they were in. So what I'm showing you here is some data that kind of hidden in supplement S6 as a table. And this is the success rate in these clusters, now grouped into quintiles, and of course ranked on their success rates. So the very success rate, highly successful quintile and the low successful quintile. White investigator PI apps are driving the ship here because there's a vast majority of them, but you can see is across all these topic quintiles, those applications with Black PIs were disadvantaged. So it doesn't matter that you apply in quote unquote the right topic domain, there's still going to be this disadvantage. Now they of course concluded that, aha, this is great, it counts for 20% of the funding gap, but they sort of ignored the fact that that means they've still got 80% of the gap, or almost 80%, that remains unexplained. I do want to give you a little bit of a flavor for what those topics look like, because it's not as simple as you might hope. But what they showed in the paper is they had a list of their clusters, the words that were associated with their clusters that were more fundable than average. So here's some that are coming in at high 20s percentile ranks, and the ones that were below average. And so here's ones that are down at 10, 11, 12, whatever percent funding rate. And you can kind of go through here, look for words. And of course, if you want to look for things like child, adolescent, psychosocial, substance use, mental health, okay, that kind of comes in here at the low ones. You have things like racial minority, African American, and disparity, et cetera, down here. But it can be a little bit difficult if you want to sort of go one by one and say, aha, look, my grants are disadvantaged. With that said, we can then, go on to think about, well, what if it's true, if there's disproportionate interest in certain topics by Black PIs, who, by the way, are only 2% of the applicants, if those sort of map disproportionately onto the topics that happen to be of interest to this 14% of the population. And if that's true, we have this problem of, rather systemic health disparity, where we have research on the health concerns of, and their tax paying, by the way, the taxes are what's paying for the NIH research. Tax paying people of color is less common, thereby reducing, identification of the things that are of interest to them, detection, remediation, cures, and all the good things that come out of the NIH research. And it turns out that's actually a problem. So Mike Lauer, who's the head of the Office of Extramural Research, the head of, handing out grants, basically, had a follow-up paper to Hoppe in which they looked at, or he explained to some extent, that look, the institutes and centers have vastly varying award rates from ones like the I Institute, that's here, this is the award rate, the I Institute at almost 27% funding rate for this sample, and then ones that are very low down here at 9% or below. And what they identified in this paper is that 5 of those 6 ICs that got more applications, or a higher proportion of the applications that had Black PIs, that they had an award rate that was below the average. So I've identified here with these red circles, you can see they kind of are, coming in below some middle level of award rate here. And so, they noticed there, they pointed out that even though these institutes and centers were handling applications from 19% of the total pool, they had 35% of the applications from African-American Black PIs. And what they sort of failed to note and to connect the dots as they was trying to excuse this on a quote unquote funding ecology, as if he had nothing to do with it, that the amount of the NIH budget really differs across the institutes and centers. And so this is just the 2020 numbers. This is the percent of the budget. So of course the Cancer Institute gets the lion's share, NIAID gets an awful lot. And then, you have some of these institutes and centers that are very poorly funded with less than 1% of the budget. These two happen to be National Institute on Minority Health and Health Disparities and the National Institute on Nursing Research. Okay, so I've kind of, that graph I showed you is a little bit difficult because what's on the x-axis is the percent of applications from all applicants in these topics that are disproportionately favored by African-American Black PIs. So that's a little bit weird to me. So what I've done is I've regraphed some of their data as the percent of the applications that were actually received by African-American PIs, from PIs. And so what you can see in this is the success rate. So it's kind of a regraphing of that, a little bit. And the red ones are the ones that are the disproportionate interest to African-American applicants. What you can see is there's sort of this, these 3 extreme outliers. Some of the ones they included here are pretty close to the rest of this, this pool. And so you kind of wonder, like, well, why did they do this? Like, what was important about using the quote unquote quartile, the preferred quartile of ICs? You know, why didn't they use the top third? Why didn't they use a half? Why didn't something, you know, what came to that decision? And importantly, you know, especially for these two that group over here, I've identified these blue ones that are very close in terms of the preference, you know, the percent of African-American applications that are going there. And there are institutes like heart, lung, blood, diabetes, digestive and kidney disorders, mental health, drug abuse, environmental health sciences. I mean, you know, it doesn't take much to realize that sounds exactly like some key health targets that have huge racial and ethnic implications. So why are they not including those ones? Well, you know, and so sorry. So that was success rate. Over here is just the appropriation, the amount of money. And you can see that, again, these outliers, low percentage of the budget, low success rates. So, you know, this brings up this point, which was actually made by my co-author in a lot of our op-eds on this topic, Nick Gilpin, who pointed out that, you know, instead of shoving this off on a, you know, this sort of irresponsible funding ecology excuse, it really reflects, you know, if we're giving less funding to the institutes and centers that are of greater interest to African-American PIs who are addressing topics that are of greater interest to issues of ethnic disparity and health disparity, this is like the very definition of systemic racism. All right, so and we get some more practical questions. So if those topics are being assigned for funding, and again, they like to construe it as if these African-American applicants are applying to those funding, which does sort of happen a little bit. But technically and ultimately, the NIH decides who is going to fund, who is going to be assigned for potential funding as far as ICs. And so they're being assigned to less well-funded institutes and centers. So why aren't they better funded? One. And then particularly, you know, the nursing research and NIMHD brings up this notion that, you know, they're supposed to be handling a broad range of grants that happen to have that may have a health disparities component, but they're subject areas, whether that be cancer, mental health, drug abuse. They have parent ICs that are much better funded and that focus on the exact same health area. So why or how are they being kicked out of their sort of parent, so to speak, ICs, or why are they not being picked up for funding? This is a little bit snotty, but you can go over to Reporter, hop over to Reporter, and look for grants that are funded by the National Institute on Minority Health and Health Disparities, which has, as I said, less than 1% of the budget. And you can find some grants. In this case, these are SBIR grants that are funded. You sort of look at the description, the abstract on it's available on Reporter, and you can look for the PI and see, aha, this one has a drug abuse grant. And if you look at the description of all these projects, two from NIMHD, one from drug abuse, you find that it's the exact same technology in this case that is being developed. Same grant. This is the same case for research grants. So here's an R01 funded by NIMHD on treatment gaps in substance abuse. And you can look for the PI and find there's this other grant, in this case an R03 funded by NIDA. And again, if you look at the description of the kind of science that's going on, it's the exact same science with a single exception of the target population. Here's another one, an NIMHD grant, has a parallel R01 at drug abuse, same exact science. And here's a U grant, so a large mechanism at NIMHD that has a parallel thing in drug abuse. And the interesting one here I noticed is this is, these grants are focused on HIV positive population. Just to remind everybody, particularly the kids in the audience, NIDA receives a very large and specific allocation from Congress to handle HIV/AIDS funding. And, you know, they've been given by Congress for decades now, essentially a third of their budget. They had a huge raise, so to speak, that they were supposed to cater, that they were supposed to basically handle for these topics. So it's particularly egregious when it's, in my view, when it's an HIV/AIDS grant. Okay, so what about what about drawing down from this idea, this funding ecology, this systemic race, this allocation of funding across institutes and centers, and that having to do, you know, that being an underlying cause of this apparent disparity in funding probability? The institutes and centers are the laboratory of the NIH, so to speak. And I think we can draw some lessons. So going back to NIDA, which again had this overall aggregate lack of Ginther gap, we can look into, well, maybe there's some things they're doing. And again, I'm just going from this presentation, this one very limited slice of information we've gotten so far from NIDA. But remind you that they have divisions within NIDA that are very different. And so they have epidemiological services and prevention research, they have neuroscience and behavior, and therapeutics and medical consequences. So as if they have sort of mini ICs within NIDA. And what they showed is that these were receiving disproportionate interest from the applications that had Black PIs. So kind of like the overall institute and center disparity, right? Where you're seeing a preference for grants in epidemiological services and prevention research. And this is kind of graphed over here, where you can see the distribution for Black PI applications, which more of them going to epidemiological services and prevention, very few on therapeutics, and the distribution for all the other non-African-American PI applications is different, with a greater concentration of interest in neuroscience and a lesser concentration in the other two, but a greater interest in therapeutics compared to the African Americans. So this is kind of like the flip side of that funding ecology, right? So it could be, we don't know, that within NIDA, if they allocate their funding in a more equitable way across the interests, that could be helping to, sort of support this apparent equivalent grant funding probability. So that could be part of the reason. Now, I keep in mind, it's not all fine and dandy, because that doesn't mean that just because people who are submitting in one division are advantaged, it doesn't mean that people who are submitting in another domain like neuroscience and behavior aren't disadvantaged. That could still be the case, but we're sort of waiting pending additional information. But like I said, if we have this institute or center that's somehow doing better, we need to look into what they're doing to find out if we have any solutions. So this kind of echoes that kind of thing where there's different kinds of grants being awarded, echoes this thing, a very exciting new there was a preprint in the summer, I guess, as of like yesterday, it was announced it was accepted at eLife, that looked at the disparity of NSF funding. So we haven't seen information from other major federal funders in the US until now. This one, unlike the other ones, was not conducted with the help of people in NSF, and so maybe limited in some ways compared to the NIH reviews, which were done, by NIH authors and with their help. So what this shows is a little bit strange, but this is research grants, grants submitted to the NSF for funding from 2013 to 2019. That's these little tick marks down here. Sorry, I had to cut this off. 2013 to 2019. And so what they're representing here is that, there's sort of a, for every year of funding, there's an NSF average. And what they're representing is change in award probability relative to this overall average. And so if the PIs were white, they have an increasing, this is 2019, almost a 15% advantage in award probability. If they had Asian PIs, they have a very low award probability relative to the expectation. And if they're Hispanic or if they're Black, in some cases, they're sort of, have been improving in recent years. Now, the reason I point this out is really the distance between these two curves and these two curves. So the lighter ones here, the open circles, are for non-research grants, training grants, infrastructure grants. The dark circles are for research grants. And so what you can see is there's this remaining disparity in research grants, but maybe not so much in infrastructure grants, right? So you can close the gap and make it look like it goes away, but you need to be careful about exactly how they are doing that, because there's still this persisting disparity of opportunity at the NSF. Okay, so, does it matter? Is it important that there are topics that are disadvantaged in securing grant funds? I'll tell you a little anecdote from the substance abuse field that I happen to like a lot. I've done a little bit of work on e-cigarettes and over the years. And in 2020, the FDA finally, at least 3 years after the middle schoolers started using vape significantly, they banned flavorants that they thought were appealing to children, that they thought were helping to drive this policy. And they left menthol unaffected. So you can still have tobacco and menthol flavored at this point in time. This is early 2020. Now, it turns out that this ban has been completely ineffective so far. So there's been a survey, this is published in the Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report, a survey of high school and middle school kids in the first half of 2022, asking what they're doing, high school and middle school kids. And of course, among those that used e-cigarettes, 85% used flavored, and among those flavors, there were fruit flavors, menthol here, very, very preferred candy, dessert, sweets, and mint. So the banning of flavorants at the FDA level has not actually worked in getting it out of the kids. All right, so what about menthol? Let's focus on menthol. So if you do a little web search for ads for Marlboro cigarettes, which are not a menthol brand, you'll see an image retrieval like this. If you look for the same thing for Cool, which is a menthol brand, you'll see a bunch of images look like this with a striking increase in African-American faces. this is probably not a surprise to most people that there's this preference for menthol cigarettes in African-American smokers. And so this has been known for a long time. There is a lot of funded research. I might say there's not enough given that accepting menthol from the ban. But here's some epidemiological research showing this, that Black individuals are twice as likely to smoke menthol cigarettes. It shows that, magazines are targeted to them, advertising, et cetera. There's other kinds of research, showing that Black youth have a lower smoking prevalence rate and initiate smoking at older ages. That's protective. So there are some things that are low until all this advertising comes to hit them. And that smoking frequency intensity, once they start smoking, might be lower, but morbidity and mortality are higher. So areas where there's clearly an interest in doing some additional research. This gets to the point of having a potential genetic association. So again, more scientific research conducted on this disparity, in which it was shown that there's a genetic variant that causes a 5 to 8-fold increase in the odds of menthol cigarette preference. And that variant happens to be present solely in persons of African ancestry. We can then go on and do some science. So Brandon Henderson, who's now associate professor at Marshall, I think he's probably in this audience, as a postdoc did some work on menthol, showing that it's not just a flavorant, right? So it is a pharmacologically active agent that's being included in cigarettes. And so he showed that menthol upregulates nicotinic acetylcholine receptors, and it helps to alter dopamine neuron baseline firing and excitability. He then went on to show that this interacted with the effects of nicotine. So menthol plus nicotine upregulates receptors, nicotinic acetylcholine receptors more, has a effect on midbrain dopamine neurons. It has this synergistic effect. It's pharmacologically active. In his career as an independent scientist, he's turned to the flavorants and how they affect e-cigarettes and vape function. So in this case, there's a particular paper here that looks at one of the fruit flavors and a constituent of the fruit flavors, looking at them. And sure enough, it does just the same thing as menthol in the sense that it increases the expression of nicotinic acetylcholine receptors, alters dopaminergic neuron firing frequency, et cetera, et cetera. And then he went on recently to show that this results in behavioral changes. And so this is a really great self-administration model of vapor, e-cigarette vapor in mice, showing that if you have them responding on a PR schedule over here, hopefully you can see this, they will respond more for nicotine than for the vehicle. If you add this fruit flavorant to it, it increases the responding. And if you add menthol, it also increases responding for nicotine relative to nicotine alone, even though they won't self-administer menthol. Okay, so it has this sort of mechanistic connection. It's a nice little story about how we have generated an awful lot of information, but even that sometimes is not enough to help make sure that regulatory bodies are doing what they should do. And we have to keep them, their feet to the fire with additional evidence, because the industry fights back if there's not evidence. This is a little bit of a different issue, and I'm gonna report this because it was shown to me by a graduate student, and I thought it was really, really interesting. So, and again, this gets back to the idea of it. What is diversity in approach and in who we're hiring and what kind of research they do? So there's this adverse childhood events scale, which is not really important. You know all this, and it's not really my area of research. But basically, it's a way of looking at the upbringing of a person and trying to ask if that adverse childhood experience affects any number of outcome measures that somebody might be interested in. There's a standard scale. It focuses on abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. And what was pointed out to me is that, look, there are some things that don't appear in this very standardized scale. Things like, what about deportation fears or even deportation events that happen to family or in the neighborhood? What about things like stereotype threat, racial discrimination, housing insecurity? What about things like bullying for gender expression and sexual orientation? These don't appear, I guess, in the standard adverse childhood events. And so, this is an area where somebody who is, and the woman was Sarah Chavez, who's as I said, in the SDSU joint doctoral program. And so, these are areas where just having a very different background, a very different appreciation of the world may help people to focus on things that are important, but are not necessarily majoritarian issues of major concern. Okay, so getting back a little bit to the individual level, since this matters so much, and since we're about to engage in these hiring initiatives and throw some new assistant professors straight into the buzzsaw, what does it take to overcome the disparity? And so, I do have to confess that as an assistant professor, way back in the day, who was focused basically exclusively on writing grants and doing some science, the average hit rate back then was about 20% for the NIH. And I thought, well, I just put in 5 grants and I'll have a fighting chance. This is great. Obviously, I'm math challenged, and there was some degree of this that was really about me being unwilling to face the music and unwilling to face how bad it was. And so really, it's not 5 grants to get a chance. You have to look at this binomial cumulative probability of awards. This is kind of like, how many lottery tickets do you have to buy given the success rate, right? So if we use those success numbers for any given application, so 17.7% for white PI applications and 10.7% for black PI applications that came out of Hoppe et al. And you look at the cumulative probability of getting an award funded to get north of 80%, it's something like 10 applications if you're at this 17.7% hit rate, and it's 18 if you're at this lower probability. Again, these are probabilities of award, doesn't guarantee that you're going to get funded, but to have a fighting chance. If you happen to be in that disadvantaged population, you don't have to just work a little bit harder. You have to work a lot harder. Those 8 more grants, as you know, I'm not going to belabor the NIH submission cycle and how long it takes, but I do want to emphasize that every single one of those applications requires credible preliminary data support. They don't write themselves. And so this is an awful lot of effort to generate those 8 additional applications that have the same probability of getting funded. And by the way, the tenure clock is ticking, right? This takes years of difference, years of effort. So there is some good news, and this is not comprehensive. But the NIH has been doing some things. I'm going to point to a couple of things that are relevant to what I've been talking about. One thing that they've done is that that poorly funded institute that handles all these minority health and health disparities, NIMHD, has gotten an increase in their appropriation. So in 2021, they had a 17% increase. I think that's higher than any other institute got. In 2022, we don't have an appropriation yet, so all we can work from is the budget request at this point in time. But they're getting a whopping 66.6% increase in their budget if they get the budget request. That's massive. Now, note that that's not grants. So actually, they're only proposing that the research grants are only going to go up by 20. Funding for research grants is only going to go up by 20%. But 17%, 20%, they are putting more money into NIMHD. And NINR, the nursing research one, which is also one of those institutes of high preference to African-American applicants and of low percentage of the budget, will also get an increase with a 14.2% increase in 2022 budget request over 2021. And they're saying that grants will increase by 42, which I haven't done the numbers, but it probably is significant given their low budget. All right, so they're putting more money into those institutes. They're investing in HBCUs. So, I found this white paper. This was SBIR focused from NIH, but it did point out that just one HBCU, Howard University, generates, so here in 2013, they generated 220 undergraduates who then went on to earn STEM degrees, PhDs somewhere else, or somewhere. And this is, noted this was just one student shy of 221 that Stanford, Harvard, MIT, and Yale produced combined. So there is a pool here, and to the extent that we're sort of addressing what's so-called pipeline problem, which I'm not very fond of. But if we want to get access to many promising proto-scientists, this is a pool which is not very well funded, apparently, from the NIH historically at the HBCUs. They were going to boost this. Now, this white paper was not very specific, and it sort of talked about providing these institutions, these universities and colleges with more information about how the NIH game works, to standardize their internal research administration, to cultivate appreciation, upper management for the goods and that can come with NIH funding. So it's very non-specific. I mean, and again, as Hoppe shows with this topic diversity thing or disparity thing, we can get more people into the system, but if we don't fix the fundamental problems of award probability bias, you're just going to now be throwing not just individuals, but whole institutions straight into the buzzsaw. Okay, what about the individual? So that was the institutional. What about the individual? They have not done much, but here's a blog post from both Mike Lauer, who I referred to before, and Marie Bernard, who's involved in one of the diversity efforts there at the NIH, and they presented some data. Now this time, we are not looking at the per application success rate, which is what I have been presenting up to this point in time. What this is a per applicant success rate. So the funding rate, as defined by them, is the percent of applicants who have submitted at least one application in that fiscal year and who have received funding. So the percent that have received funding out of all who have submitted at least one application. They could have submitted 10 and gotten one award. They could have submitted 1 and gotten 1 award. They could have submitted 10 and gotten 5 awards. They all count the same. But what they've shown is that in 2020, post George Floyd, no doubt, all of a sudden the funding rate for Black PIs, for RPGs, research project grants, went up. And if you look at R01s, it's the same effect. So it's not just selected, it's not just necessarily just the tiny grants, the R03s and the R21s that are pumping this up. There's been some improvement in R01s as well. That's all great. It's great to have more people funded. But, in almost anything NIH does, as you may know, you may have gleaned from this talk, I'm a little bit suspicious about their intentions. And basically, they've been trying to make themselves look good as best they can. So you might ask yourself, first of all, why don't they start with every single one of these analysis with the same data, right? Why are you looking at some different data? Why are you not looking at the per applicant success rate as well as the per application success rate as well as the per applicant success rate? And of course, one suspects that's because that doesn't look as good. But there's something important here, which is that if you go back and you look at these, the funding rate, you can look at this in terms of a percentile point gap, right? So back in 2019, before they started doing anything, it looks like there was something on the order of about a 10 percentile point gap in the funding rate. And they've closed this in more recent years to be about 6 or 7, about 4 here, something like that. So they've kind of closed the gap. Now they haven't completely closed the gap. And I do want to point out that there is no sense that if we're going along this trend and all of a sudden there's a boost in 2020 and 2021, there's no sense that they've fixed some fundamental problem. This is picking up grants by one way or another, by redistributing their funding priorities. Now that may be because they put more money into NIMHD and NINR. It could be because they put more money into certain topics. It could be because they just picked up applications with Black applicants. We don't really know. But a change like this, coincident with what was going on, this is funding priority. This is not fixing the systemic problems. Okay, so given that they're meddling like this, you wonder, why didn't they just close the gap entirely? Why have they only gotten partway there? And this is even more egregious when you think about the fact that the vast majority of applications are from white applicants, and a very tiny percentage, low single digits, have Black PIs. And so what helps you to realize is that each one of these percentage points gains for funding rate of Black PIs equals 12 funded PIs. A percentage point in the white application pool, every percentage point change represents 257, right? So to close this final 4, if let's say it's 4 percentile point gap for African-American applicants, that would only be 48, which is a tiny fraction of the 1, percentile point for white. So you have to look at this stuff a little bit skeptically about what they're actually doing versus what they kind of show you, like, oh, we're looking busy here. So what does this mean for promotion and tenure? And so I kind of picked on UNL, and I wrote this talk about 6 months ago because I found this memo from their executive vice chancellor that was sort of in amongst a bunch of documents, and I kind of was looking at their assertions that they were looking to diversify the campus. And this is a really very poignant point because this generalizes across an awful lot of efforts to diversify the academy that have been in place since I was an undergraduate, which is that every decision, in this case, tenure promotion, should be judged against the same standard, right? There's vast worry that, oh, we're sort of dumbing down our standards to diversify the academy. We can't let in these Black PIs because they do crappier science, right? That's the thought. So in this case, every tenure promotion decision has to be judged against the same standard. Well, this brings up these questions of equity. So I finally found the cartoon that I like better because it represents people of equal size instead of this adult child thing. But, this is the idea of what is equity. And if you have an individual population that starts in a hole for various reasons or faces higher barriers or both, they don't have the same opportunity to see the baseball game in this case. And if you just sort of boost them up to the point where we sort of overcome these deficits, they can have equal access. I talked about the cumulative probability of award and how it took 8 more grants. Well, if you have this population of investigators who are going to require to put in, on average, 8 more grant proposals by the time the tenure bar hits in order to have a fighting chance to get a grant, how could this possibly be judging them against the same standard, right? So there's clear, I want to summarize a little bit here first. There's clear implications for you as you're trying to diversify your campuses, which is that, if you're going to hire Black assistant professors in the biomedical sciences, they need more time to write more proposals, to revise and resubmit proposals. That depends on startup money, because they have to have something to devote to generating preliminary studies to support those extra proposals. That means they may need more trainees. That could be graduate programs, 232s, or programs. Ultimately, they need more runway to sustain that initial laboratory growth for years, potentially. I didn't really talk about this so much in this talk, sorry, but there's some aspects of the data that come out of the Ginther reports that suggest that we really need to be supporting faculty with these non-exploitative collaborations. It can't just be a two-way street. It can't be using this new Penny's great new assay or approach. We have to really support with, in a way that advantages them. And this is the hard one. So I'm going to turn to this a little bit, but we got to recognize a systemic way, and that means at institutional promotion committees. That, as I said at the start of the talk, this necessity to get a grant has been baked into these tenure criteria for 3 decades at least, and it all kind of started from an era when grants were much easier to get. So we need to recognize these higher funding hurdles, not just the overall. There's an overall problem for young faculty. Funding rates are way down. But it really needs to be specific to the hiring and attempts to diversify faculty, these cluster initiatives. And, and beating that into the heads of the university-wide promotions committee, you need to recognize there's also aspects of these data that I showed you that the disparity still exists for full professors, those with grant experience, those who have sat on study section panels. They're still at disadvantage compared to their white, comparably trained and experienced peers. And as I was going over for the Hoppe study, it shows that it also exists across all topic domains, regardless of the fundability of those domains. You can't just hire people that work in eye research, although apparently that would be a good thing, and expect them to have greater success. The data show they're still at a disadvantage. All right, so this turns to the what can we do part of the talk, and of course education, which we're trying to do today. And yes, you should probably publish some pointed letters if you could to your society journals, and preach the gospel to program officers. But ultimately, look, we're peer review and we are the primary contributor to what gets funded. I do like to point out that this is a problem of 1,000 cuts. Hopefully I've given you some flavor of that, but this is not about these guys constituting study sections, right? It's a distraction. There may be some explicitly racist views and even some fairly detectable implicit racist views, but the scope of the problem is far too large, and I hope I've given you some flavor of where these effects sit everywhere in the system. With that said, peer review is the major contributor to what gets funded. We are 10 years after Ginther. We had a perfect replication in the Hoppe et al. Publication. We've had confirmation at the NIAAA and NIMH, I didn't show you, but NIMDS level as well. And we had a year ago pushback from the Office of the Director from Francis Collins against little tiny baby steps that 3 of the institutes were trying to take just to get the information about their applicants into their systems, so they could do something with it. And ultimately, when we operate in good faith within these systems that we know are unjust, we're perpetuating that injustice, and our inaction at this point turns into action. It is action. We do nothing. Rick kind of brushed on this. I have an unhealthy interest in thinking about the systems of NIH and how grant awards are funded, and I always have. One of the biggest problems is the inherent conservatism. In order to be on an R01 reviewing panel, you have to have won an R01, which means that you've been selected by the system already as it exists for having interests, approaches, goals, whatever, that are consistent with those of the prior reviewers in funded populations, or at least you've been beaten into the form by hard experience. And that's inherently conservative, right? It's a cycle that we can't escape. We do know that review is highly subjective, despite what the NIH would like to pretend to themselves. But ultimately, the best scores go to those topics of interest to the individual reviewers that they find as be significant. It's got to use methods that they approve of, and it has to be written, this is grant smithing, in the quote unquote right way. And given that, there aren't NIH panel selection rules for diversity and gender, geography, zip code, whatever science topic, but it can't really impose this inherent sort of cyclical conservatism. And note that only about 2% of reviewers are Black, not that 14% of the population. And it just can't provide balance. It's less than one person per study section. This is a little vignette about how that topic choice thing interacts with potential racial differences in the health concern and the peer review problem. So this is about powder cocaine. Nick Gilpin, my co-author in many of these pieces, wrote a frustrated tweet about getting a 9 for significance about establishing a model of crack cocaine exposure. It doesn't take you anything to Google up or PubMed up studies showing that there are implications for Black individuals who, for example, use powder cocaine less than average and increased use of crack cocaine. Those of you who've grown up in the 80s and 90s have a better understanding of how important this has been over the years for everything from individuals to policy. And then there's a difference in cocaine overdose. So this is just an area where, somebody found that to not be significant after 4 decades of this racially attached scientific issue. So, the question becomes, well, what can we do in a systemic way? I think one thing is that we can really try to ourselves stop reviewing the basis of what's of personal interest to us and really try to grapple with what's of interest to the applicants. There are some technical fixes that we could try. So for example, there's this mantra in study section review that the burden of triage shouldn't fall on small mechanisms, shouldn't fall on early stage investigator applications. And there's data in these papers, again, dating back to 2011, that show that the applications from African-American Black PIs are 1.5 times more likely to be triaged. So this is a simple sort of technical fix, like maybe the burden of triage shouldn't fall on Black PIs. There's some interesting points about what is merit, but one thing I do like to point out, which is that in the Hoppe et al. Data set, buried again in a table and listed in the main paper, they basically identified 119 applications that were funded with white PIs at percentile 35 or above, which is a terrible score in this day and age. No applications with Black PIs were funded at this percentile or worse. And of course, there were numerous Black PI applications at better scores that weren't funded. So we need to abandon this idea and grapple with it. Okay, I'm going to skip over the publication metrics thing so that we can get to question and answers. So sorry, I'm going to skip past some things about citation. I will just end by saying that there are numerous commentaries now. These are some of the earlier ones. This is one that's pretty good in Cell from a group of Black biomedical engineers. And then, as I've kind of alluded to a couple of times, Nick Gilpin and I wrote this op-ed thing, this feature article in eLife. Thank you for your attention. I will take some questions, and I will underline the notion that you meet some of the very best people on study section.
Thank you for that very much. Much appreciated.